The giant rancher never smiled until the bride's triplets called him Papa Bear. The wind carried a soft stir of hay and dust across Bear Creek Ranch that morning, brushing along the fence rails and rattling the tin patch on the old feed room roof. But the giant rancher standing at the far gate didn't move an inch. Elias Hartley, taller than most door frames, shoulders broad enough to block out half the sunrise, just gripped the top rail with one large hand, watching the wagon approach with the same unreadable expression that had turned him into half-legend, half-warning across 3 counties. The driver slowed as he neared the gate, glancing nervously at the man he'd heard 100 rumors about. Never smiled, never softened, never forgot. But it was the woman beside him, small, tired, clutching 3 children so closely they looked sewn into her sleeves, who held Elias's gaze. She stepped down carefully, boots sinking slightly in the dusty ground, and gathered the triplets around her, 2 boys with matching mop-brown hair and eyes too wary for their age, and a tiny girl in a faded blue dress clutching a ragged cloth doll against her chest. They stood frozen when Elias approached, his shadow dropping over them like a slow-moving cloud as he unlatched the gate with a low metallic groan. "Mrs. Alder?" he said, voice deep enough to vibrate the rail. She swallowed. "Yes. I rode ahead. I'm here about the position. Cook, cleaner, hand with small chores." She didn't mention the real truth written in her eyes, that she had nowhere else to go, and 3 mouths who depended on her being brave today. Elias nodded once, stiffly, as if he hadn't spoken more than 5 words to anyone in months. "You'll work. You'll have a roof. You'll earn your keep." His gaze lowered briefly to the children. "Them too?" She winced, afraid of the answer he might give. "They're mine," she whispered. "They help where they can, and they don't cause trouble." The boys shrank behind her. The girl pressed her doll tighter. Elias didn't flinch, didn't soften, didn't even blink. He only stepped aside to let them through, his giant frame shifting like a barn door, opening just wide enough for light to slip in. "I got room in the bunkhouse till the cabin's fixed," he said. "Not much, but it holds." She nodded gratefully, but the children didn't move. Their feet seemed planted to the ground, as if the ranch itself were too big, too quiet, too heavy with the weight of the man standing before them. Elias exhaled, long, slow, almost troubled, then crouched down with surprising care, resting one knee in the dirt until he was eye level with the smallest girl. It was a strange sight, a man built like a cliff lowering himself before a child who could barely hold her own doll upright. The girl blinked at him wide-eyed. Elias studied her with that heavy, unreadable gaze, then shifted his attention to the boys peeking from behind their mother's skirt. "You scared?" he asked plainly. All 3 nodded. He nodded back once, as if that answer made perfect sense. "Good," he said. "Means you know this place is big, and big places can be good places if you walk quiet the first day." The girl tilted her head. It wasn't a smile. Elias never smiled. But the edge of his voice had softened. Just a shade, enough that the boys stepped out a little farther. Their mother's shoulders sagged with relief so subtle she probably didn't know she'd done it. Elias finally rose to his full height again, boots settling into the dirt with a quiet thud. "Come on," he said, turning toward the yard. "Long day ahead." The triplets looked at each other, uncertain, whisper small, but when their mother moved forward, they followed. And though none of them noticed it, Elias slowed his steps just slightly, making room for 3 small shadows to walk beside him instead of behind. It wasn't a smile. Not yet. But something shifted in the dust that morning, quiet as a breath, something that hadn't moved in him for a very long time. Bear Creek Ranch settled into its late morning rhythm as the sun climbed higher, warming the dew off the corral rails and sending soft rays glinting over the grazing hills. But inside the main yard, where wagons rested and tools hung neatly on worn nails, a quieter tension moved between the new arrivals and the giant rancher, who seemed carved from the same timber his barn was built from. Elias led them toward the bunkhouse, his strides long, deliberate, yet he paused at every corner as if remembering the world was suddenly full of smaller footsteps that couldn't keep up. The triplets trailed behind their mother, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting to the rancher each time he slowed or turned. The oldest boy, Sam, kept pulling his younger brother Cole away from wagon wheels and stray tools, fearful of touching something that might earn the rancher's anger. Little June, the smallest of the three, clung tightly to the ragged doll tucked under her chin, staring at Elias with a strange mixture of awe and suspicion. Inside the bunkhouse, dust motes swirled lazily in the beams of sunlight filtering through the single window, illuminating a space spartan but clean. 2 bunks, a small table, a wood stove that looked recently patched. Elias stepped in first, checking the rafters with a practiced glance. "Roof don't leak," he said. "Night gets cold here. Fires burn safe if you keep 'em low." Their mother nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thank you. This'll do just fine." Elias shifted, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly as if he wasn't used to people thanking him. "There's stew in the pot at noon. You earn it with work." The woman stiffened instinctively, not at the words, but the tone. Not cruel, not unkind. Just plain. Hard. Like a man who had lived too long speaking to no one but cattle in the quiet wind across the pastures. Sam raised his hand shyly, voice cracking with nerves. Sir, do we gotta work too?" Elias turned to him, and for a heartbeat the boy looked ready to run. The rancher's gaze traveled from Sam's worn boots to his skinny arms, then to Cole, who hid halfway behind him, and finally to June, who sat on the bunk tracing circles in the dust with her foot. "Work looks different for small hands," Elias said, tone gentler than his face. "You stay near your ma. Keep out of the west barn, that's all." Sam blinked, confused. That's all? For now." The woman exhaled with a relief so palpable she had to steady herself on the table, but the moment softened only for a second before Elias stepped back, expression locking into its usual stone-set lines. "I don't talk much," he said, eyes fixed somewhere near the doorframe instead of on her. "My ranch hands quit last winter. I do most everything myself." She nodded, unsure what he was trying to say. "That's all right. I'm here to help." He hesitated, fingers flexing at his sides as though words were heavier to lift than hay bales. "If I seem rough," he muttered, "it ain't you, just how things are." She inhaled slowly, realizing this was the closest thing to an apology he had probably offered anyone in years. "I understand," she said softly. "Hard lives make quiet people." Something flickered behind Elias's eyes, something too brief to name, and he turned toward the door just as June's doll slipped from her lap and thudded to the floorboards. Before the child could hop down to fetch it, the rancher stooped, an awkward, uncertain motion for a man of his size, and picked it up by its tiny yarn arm. June froze. Her brothers froze. Their mother froze. Elias held the doll out to her, not quite knowing whether to offer it gently or simply hand it over. June took it with both hands, wide-eyed, whispering a tiny, "Thank you." Elias nodded once, sharp, almost abrupt, but the tiniest crack had appeared in the grim line of his expression. He didn't smile. Not yet. But for the first time, the possibility of one flickered, buried beneath years of something heavier. And as he stepped back out into the sunlight, the triplets watched him go with a quiet curiosity, as if they sensed he wasn't nearly as unreachable as the world had told them. By late afternoon, the sky above Bear Creek Ranch had begun to churn with the muted purple-gray of a storm rolling off the northern ridge, the kind that carried the scent of lightning long before the first drop fell, and Elias noticed it before anyone else, pausing at the fence line as the wind shifted and the horses in the far pasture lifted their heads in uneasy unison. He muttered something under his breath, half warning, half habit, and turned toward the bunkhouse where the triplets' laughter mixed timidly with the clatter of wooden cups as their mother tried to settle them for supper. The door creaked open, and she looked up just as a gust slapped dust across the yard. "Storm coming fast," he rumbled. "This one's sharp. Bunkhouse roof's patched, but not for winds like this. You'll come to the main house." She blinked, startled, because the giant rancher didn't invite anyone anywhere, not even men who'd worked for him 3 seasons straight. "Are you sure?" she asked. "We don't want to impose—" A low crack of thunder drowned the end of her sentence, and Elias simply gestured with one hand, firm and final. "Gather them. Bring the quilt. Move quick." The triplets didn't need more convincing. Sam scooped up his tin cup, Cole grabbed their mother's skirt, and June hugged her doll with both arms, eyes widening as another gust rattled the bunkhouse door. They followed Elias through the yard just as the first drops of rain began to fall, big, cold, heavy, and the wind pushed at them sideways, making June stumble until Elias bent down without thinking, lifting her onto his hip with a motion so natural it surprised even him. The girl wrapped her arms around his neck instantly, trusting him with a certainty that knocked something loose inside his chest. Inside the ranch house, the fire was already crackling low in the stone hearth, its warm glow painting the walls golden as if trying to hold back the storm pressing against the windows. Elias set June gently onto a thick braided rug and moved toward the hearth, tossing 2 more logs onto the flames with the easy familiarity of a man who'd spent years speaking only to fire and silence. The mother wiped raindrops from the boy's hair, guiding them to sit near the warmth. "Thank you," she murmured. "I didn't expect—" "Storms don't ask permission," Elias said, not looking at her as he stirred the fire. "You don't either when safety's the question." She watched him for a moment, the way his shoulders rose and fell under the soft firelight, the faint tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his posture, not from anger, but from uncertainty, as though he didn't know how to act with people inside his quiet world. Sam approached him hesitantly, clutching a wooden toy horse he'd carved himself. "Mr. Elias?" he said, voice wavering. Elias glanced down. Is it okay if we sit here?" He nodded. "Fires for everyone." The boy's eyes brightened, and he motioned for Cole and June to come closer. They gathered around the hearth, their small bodies glowing orange in the flickering light. Elias stepped back a little, arms folded, trying, and almost failing, to appear unaffected. A sharp crack of thunder made June squeak and scoot closer to Sam, but the next flash of lightning was brighter, shaking the windows, and without realizing it, she reached behind her for the nearest stability her small hands could find, Elias's trouser leg. He froze. She froze. But her tiny fist didn't let go. Slowly, with a stiffness that had nothing to do with fear, Elias lowered himself onto one knee again, letting June hide against his side as the boys leaned forward to watch the rain lash against the glass. Their mother watched in quiet awe as the man who never smiled braced himself against the storm, not with stoic loneliness this time, but with 3 small children clinging to the edges of his strength as if they'd been meant to all along. Another crack of thunder shook the house, and June whimpered into his shirt. Elias's hand, huge, calloused, unsure, lifted and gently rested on her back. Not a smile, not yet, but a beginning. And outside, the storm raged on, powerless now to scatter the small circle forming in the heart of his quiet home. The storm passed in the night with a long, low growl that faded into the distance like a tired animal retreating into the hills, and by morning, the ranch breathed easier again, the earth damp, the air fresh, and thin ribbons of steam rising from the fence rails as the early sun warmed them. Elias stepped out of the ranch house first, boots sinking slightly into the softened dirt, the faint scent of wet cedar drifting from the barn. He adjusted the brim of his hat and scanned the yard with the careful, habitual sweep of a man who had lived too long, depending on his own vigilance. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Sam peeked out, hair rumpled, shirt too big, eyes bright with the kind of excitement children tried to hide when they weren't sure if it was allowed. Elias didn't comment, simply nodded at the boy, then jerked his chin toward the barn. "Animals will be hungry after all that noise," he said. "Storm spooks 'em bad." Sam hesitated, unsure if that was an invitation, but when Elias turned and started walking, he followed with quick little steps. Cole came next, dragging June by the wrist as she clutched her doll and blinked sleepily at the morning light. Their mother lingered at the doorway, watching the way the giant rancher slowed his pace by almost half without seeming to realize it, adjusting his long stride so 3 pairs of small boots could keep up. Inside the barnyard, the animals greeted them with snorts and soft bleats, the horses stamping gently in their stalls. Elias handed Sam a bucket, not heavy, just enough weight to feel important. "Fill this at the pump. Slow, steady, don't splash." Sam nodded vigorously. Cole stared at him, then at the rancher. "What about me?" Elias squatted down, eye level with him again, pointing toward the feed trough. "Think you can take this scoop? It's smaller, needs careful hands." Cole puffed up proudly and took it with both palms, wobbling toward the trough with intense concentration. June hovered near the barn door, uncertain, the hem of her dress brushing the damp straw. Elias noticed. "You like animals?" he asked. She shrugged, pressing her doll to her cheek. "Only if they don't bite." "Then you'll like Daisy," Elias murmured and motioned her to follow. He led her to a stall where a calm, aging mare stood with gentle eyes. June stretched on her toes to peek over the half door. Daisy lifted her head and sniffed her softly. June giggled, the sound light and small, like bells muffled under blankets. Elias watched her, and something slow and warm shifted inside him, a quiet recognition he didn't invite, but didn't resist either. Her mother stepped into the barnyard then, apron tied around her waist, hair pinned up neatly despite the sleepless night. "You're good with them," she said quietly. Elias stiffened, unused to praise. "Kids?" "All three," she said. "And Daisy, too." He cleared his throat, pretending to adjust the bridle hook on the wall. "Animals listen better than people. Kids, too, sometimes." She smiled softly at that, so softly he nearly missed it. The triplets finished their tasks proudly. Sam carried the water bucket with both arms, teeth clenched. Cole announced loudly that he fed half the trough, and June stroked Daisy's nose like the horse was made of something breakable. Then, with the unthinking generosity children have, Cole pulled something from his pocket and held it out to Elias, a small, uneven wooden carving of what looked like a bear. "Made it yesterday," Cole said shyly. "Storm was loud. Mama said make something quiet." Elias stared at it, rough edges, crooked snout, one ear bigger than the other, and for a long moment didn't know what to do with the feeling rising in his chest. Sam nudged his brother. "He won't want it," Sam whispered. "He don't like things." Elias heard it, and without thinking, without planning, without even meaning to soften, he opened his enormous hand, palm up. "I'll keep it," he said. Cole's face lit up like the sun hitting fresh snow. June bounced on her toes. Sam grinned so wide it nearly cracked his cheeks. Their mother exhaled slowly, watching the most unexpected thing unfold, the giant rancher standing in a barnyard holding a crooked little wooden bear like it was something worth guarding. And though Elias didn't smile, not quite, not yet, his expression loosened in a way that made the whole yard feel suddenly warmer, as if the barn itself had leaned in closer to witness the first crack in the wall built around his heart. The day settled into a bright, wind-brushed calm, the kind that made the ranch feel larger than it already was, rolling pastures shimmering under sunlight, the creek whispering against its banks, and the sky stretching wide enough to ease even the heaviest minds. But by late afternoon, a thin, unwelcome figure appeared at the far north fence line, riding a bay horse with a slowness that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with ownership. Elias spotted him first while checking a loose rail, his posture sharpening instantly, shoulders going still in that quiet way men do when instincts speak louder than words. The triplets were playing nearby, Sam stacking smooth river stones, Cole trying to knock them down with careful pebbles, and June humming to her doll under the shade of a cottonwood when they noticed Elias's gaze fix hard on the horizon. Their mother stepped out of the henhouse carrying a small basket of eggs, following Elias's line of sight, and the moment she saw the man approaching, the basket slipped from her fingers, one egg cracking at her boots. Color drained from her face like the wind had stolen it. "No," she whispered, "not here, not now." Elias didn't ask who the man was, not yet. He didn't need the explanation to recognize the kind of threat that slithered toward safety. The rider slowed even further as he neared, lifting his chin with that smug arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him the ease of every step. "Afternoon," he called out lazily. "Fine place you've got here. Surprised you took on help without asking around first." The woman stepped behind Elias instinctively, her hands trembling as she pulled the triplets close. Sam clung to her skirt, Cole gripped her hip, June hid behind her legs, peeking out with frightened eyes. Elias didn't move from where he stood, but his presence grew heavier, more solid, as if the ground itself stiffened beneath his boots. "State your business," he said, voice flat. The rider smirked, sliding off his horse with a practiced ease, boots hitting the dirt with the smug certainty of someone who believed himself untouchable. "Name's Warren Adler," he said, Her husband. The woman choked on a breath. "You're not my husband," she whispered, voice shaking. "There was never a wedding. Just promises you twisted." Warren rolled his eyes with a sharp grin. "A promise is as good as a contract in these parts. You ran off with my property," Cole whimpered. June pressed her face into her mother's dress. Elias stepped once, not far, not aggressive, but enough to draw a line the rider couldn't cross without stepping into danger. "She's not your property," he said, voice deepening. "She works here. She's safe here." Warren's smile sharpened. "You think you can hide her? You think a giant rancher playing family with another man's bride scares me?" His gaze flicked to the children. "Cute kids. Shame they don't know who their daddy is." The woman swallowed a sob. "You're not their father," she forced out. "You never were." Warren shrugged. "Don't matter. Folks talk, and talking's enough for me to claim what's mine." Elias's jaw clenched, slowly, dangerously. "Not here it ain't." Warren stepped closer, boots crunching over the dry grass. "She owes me," he hissed. "I fed her family. I housed them. I kept her alive after beating me," she whispered, voice cracking, "after locking me in that shed, after threatening the children." Warren's face darkened. "Watch your mouth, girl." Elias moved before another word left the man's lips, one slow, decisive step that brought him nearly chest to chest with the intruder, forcing Warren to tilt his head back just to meet his eyes. "You're done talking," Elias said. Warren laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. "You gonna hit me? Big man like you? Right in front of these kids?" "No," Elias said calmly. "I'm not hitting you." But the way he stood, silent, immovable, carved out of sheer will, made the rider's amusement crumble like old wood. "You'll leave," Elias said. "Now." Warren spat onto the dirt. "I'll be back with proof she's mine." "You bring men," Elias said, "and I'll bury the truth so deep under witnesses that no judge will let you breathe near her again." Warren faltered, one small step backward, but his glare stayed sharp. "This ain't over." He spun, mounted his horse, and rode off in a trail of anger and dust. The triplets clung tighter to their mother, who shook with fear she'd been holding in for years. Elias watched the rider disappear over the rise, shoulders set, jaw tight, fists flexing once at his sides. Then he turned toward the trembling mother and the 3 children tucked under her arms. "He's not touching you," Elias said, voice low but certain. "Not here. Not ever again." And for the first time, the triplets looked up at the giant rancher not with caution, but with trust. The rider's dust had barely settled on the far ridge before the ranch seemed to hold its breath, the quiet stretching thin like a rope pulled too tight. Even the wind slowed, brushing only lightly through the tall grass of the creekside meadow where Elias led them, slowly, steadily, putting distance between the children and the panic that had cracked open their mother's chest. The meadow behind Bear Creek Ranch was a soft pocket of land, bordered by cottonwoods and fed by a thin vein of creek water that shimmered under the afternoon light. It was a place Elias rarely visited during the day, preferring it as a refuge in the hours when nightfall threatened old memories. But today, he chose it because it was open, safe, away from the sightline of the road Warren Adler would return on. The triplets followed him tightly, their steps small and uneven, their eyes flicking from their mother to the giant rancher who walked ahead with a stiffness that wasn't fear, but fury held on a leash. When they reached the creek's edge, Elias stopped beside a fallen log and motioned silently for them to sit. They obeyed instantly, Sam climbing up first, Cole scrambling after him, June settling on their mother's lap with her doll crushed between her shaking hands. Elias remained standing at first, the way a man does when he's trying to balance the anger in his ribs with the need to speak gently. "That man," he said at last, staring out at the water rather than at her. "He hurt you before." She nodded, unable to form words. "And he'll try again," Elias continued, "because men like him don't know how to let go of control they never earned." The triplets stiffened. Sam's hand crept toward his mother's sleeve. Cole nudged closer. June buried her face in her doll's faded head. Their mother's voice came out fragile as a cracked glass. "He used to come around our old farm, promised he'd help, but every favor cost something, every kindness twisted into a threat. When my husband died, Warren acted like he owned us, me, the farm, the children. She swallowed hard. When I refused to marry him, he locked me in the grain shed until the children cried loud enough for the neighbors to hear. After that, I ran. We've been running since. Elias's jaw tightened so sharply a muscle jumped along his cheek. No one runs anymore, he said, voice low but iron mixed. Not on my land. June lifted her head at that, tiny face soft, tear-streaked but trusting, and reached out with one small hand, placing it cautiously on Elias's boot. It wasn't a gesture made from thought. It was instinct, child instinct, the same pure recognition that lets animals know who is safe before adults even understand the danger. Elias froze, breath catching in his chest, because that tiny hand resting on him was more powerful than any oath he could speak. Sam followed next, scooting closer until his shoulder brushed Elias's leg. Then Cole, always the most nervous, leaned forward until his forehead touched Elias's knee like a silent question. Elias didn't move for several seconds. He didn't know how to. Not when 3 small children had just anchored themselves to him like he was the only thing in the world strong enough to hold back the storm. Their mother covered her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. Elias finally crouched down, not towering, not looming, just lowering himself until he met them at their height, his knees sinking into the soft grass. "Listen," he said quietly, looking at each of them in turn. "No matter what he says, no matter what papers he waves, he cannot take you, he cannot touch your ma, not while I'm standing." Cole sniffed. "But he said he'd come back with men." Elias nodded once. "Then I'll be ready with more truth than he can carry." Sam looked up, voice small. "Are we safe here?" Elias didn't look away from them, didn't blink, didn't hesitate. "With me," he said. "You are." June released her doll just long enough to wrap both arms around Elias's forearm, hugging it with all the fierce determination her tiny body could muster. Something inside him broke open, quiet, invisible, like ice melting after a long winter. He rested his other hand over hers, huge, covering tiny, and the boys pressed closer until the 4 of them formed a tight knot of warmth in the shadow of the creekside cottonwoods. Their mother watched, breath shaking, because she understood something essential had just shifted. The children hadn't asked him to protect them. They had chosen him. And Elias, who had built his life around not feeling anything at all, felt the weight of that choice settle into him like a promise he could never break. The sun sagged low behind the ridge by the time Elias led them back toward the ranch, the triplets staying so close to him that their shadows blended into the long silhouette cast by his frame. The air cooled, carrying the scent of wet earth and faint pine resin, and instead of taking them straight toward the bunkhouse or the main house, Elias veered toward a small workshop tucked behind the barn, a weathered wooden structure with a slanted roof, hand-forged tools hanging neatly from beams, and old leather tack resting over sawhorses. It was a quiet place, a place no one went except Elias himself, and their mother realized with a start that she might be the first person he had ever willingly brought inside. He pushed open the creaking door and gestured for the triplets to step in. "Stay where I can see you," he said, not sternly, but with the protective rhythm that had become natural to him in the span of a single day. The boys wandered toward a corner stacked with smooth scrap wood, their eyes lighting up at the odd shapes and half-finished carvings scattered across an old table. June climbed onto a stool beside them, swinging her small legs as she inspected the wooden animals lined neatly along a shelf. Horses, calves, a wolf, a bear, each carved with such patience it was hard to imagine the same hands that shaped them were also capable of wrestling cattle or lifting fence rails alone. Their mother stepped in last, wiping her palms against her skirt, unsure why Elias had brought them here, until she saw him standing near the far workbench, staring at a thick wooden frame draped with burlap. His shoulders rose and fell once in a slow, controlled breath before he pulled the burlap down. Inside the frame, behind dusty glass, was a faded drawing, childlike, uneven lines, bright colors that time had softened but not erased. 3 children stood in that crude picture, 2 older boys and a little girl between them. A woman knelt behind them. A man stood beside them, broad-shouldered, holding a small carved horse in his hand. The mother inhaled sharply, stepping closer. "Your family?" Elias's jaw flexed once before he nodded. "Long time ago." Sam paused beside him, eyes tracing the drawing. Where are they? Elias didn't answer right away. He rested his hand on the edge of the workbench, thumb brushing the uneven grain of the wood as though grounding himself in the feeling. My wife died first, he said finally, voice low. Fever took her in 2 days. Kids weren't old enough to understand what grief does to a man. Cole's expression softened, worry knitting his brow. Elias continued, more slowly now. I tried raising them alone, tried harder than I knew how, but storms don't always break outside. Some break. He tapped his chest once with 2 fingers. In here. June's small hand reached for his trouser leg again, but this time Elias didn't freeze. He let it stay, his breath hitching the tiniest bit. One winter, he said, voice thickening. River rose too fast. Ice broke thick as bone. They were playing near the bank. I heard them scream before I saw the water take them. His voice cracked just once, one quiet fracture in an otherwise unmoving man. I got the oldest 2 out, he continued. The little one I couldn't find in time. Silence fell heavy in the workshop, broken only by the occasional whistle of wind slipping between loose shutters. Sam's throat tightened. That's why you don't smile? Elias didn't answer the boy directly. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. The mother stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. You blamed yourself. Elias stared at the drawing. A father's job is to keep his children safe, he murmured. I failed mine. Haven't found a reason to smile since. June pressed her doll into his hand without a word, as if offering him the only comfort she understood. Elias stared at the little fabric bundle, his enormous fingers trembling ever so slightly as he took it. It wasn't your fault, Sam whispered. Storms happen. Cole nodded. You saved 2. June leaned her head against his knee. You save us too. And something in those 4 small words struck him deeper than any storm ever had. His breath shuddered, his eyes closed, his shoulders loosened with a pain long carried, long buried. He gently placed June's doll back into her hands and rested his palm on her head, a gesture so tender their mother felt her eyes burn. Elias exhaled long and slow, the weight of years leaving his chest in a breath he hadn't allowed himself to release until now. Maybe, he said quietly. Maybe some storms. Bring back what others took. And though he didn't smile, not yet, the ground beneath the workshop seemed to shift with the first hint that he finally might. Evening settled over Bear Creek Ranch with a gold-washed quiet, the kind of calm that wrapped the hills like a warm blanket. But Elias's instincts twitched the moment the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint metallic scent he didn't like, horses running where they shouldn't be. He stiffened outside the workshop, eyes narrowing toward the upper paddock where the ranch's gentlest mare, Daisy, grazed with her new foal. The triplets were still inside playing with scraps of wood when June's high, frightened scream sliced through the air like a blade. Elias moved before the sound finished leaving her throat, bolting toward the paddock with a speed that shocked even him, boots pounding the damp earth as the mare's panicked whinny echoed over the ridge. June had slipped under the fence to pet the foal, unaware that a broken rail on the far side had left the gate unsecured, and the mare, startled by a rattlesnake slithering from under a rock, had reared, sending June stumbling backward toward the slope beyond the paddock. Her mother saw her only as a blur of blue dress tumbling downhill, Sam shouting her name and Cole crying as they clawed at the fence. Elias reached the slope in 3 enormous strides, sliding down the wet grass just in time to catch June before her small body rolled into the rocky dip near the creek. She hit his chest with a choked sob, arms flying around his neck as he wrapped both hands around her tiny back to keep her from slipping further. I've got you, he breathed, voice rough with fear he never let surface, fear he hadn't felt since the river stole his child. June clung to him like he was the only solid thing in the world. Don't let go, she whimpered. Don't let go, Mr. Elias. He tightened his grip, lifting her slowly, carefully, the slope slick beneath his boots. I won't, he whispered fiercely. Not ever. The boys reached the top of the hill just as Elias climbed back over the fence with June safe in his arms, their mother rushing forward with a broken cry that told him she had imagined a dozen horrors in the seconds June vanished from sight. June buried her face in Elias's neck and sobbed, trembling, her tiny fists gripping the back of his shirt. Sam tried to hide his tears, wiping them roughly with a sleeve, while Cole pressed his forehead against Elias's arm, as if needing to feel the heat of the man who had kept them whole. Elias's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, not from exertion, but from the ghost of an old terror rising and, finally, fading as June's heartbeat thudded warm and fast against him. Her mother reached trembling hands toward her daughter, but June only loosened her grip enough to shift, just slightly, and then she said it, the softest, smallest word shaped by trust instead of fear. "Papa," she whispered. Elias froze, completely. June lifted her head, cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. "Papa Bear, don't let me fall." The words hit him harder than the river, harder than the grief he'd carried for years, harder than the memory of the child he couldn't save. Sam nodded instantly, stepping closer. "He is Papa Bear," he said, voice shaking. "He saved us." Cole sniffled. "He keeps us safe." Their mother covered her mouth. The tears she'd been fighting spilling as she watched the moment unfold, the moment no one could have forced, no moment money or promises or threats could buy. Elias slowly lowered to one knee, June still clinging to him, and for the first time in years, years full of silence, guilt, and storms he couldn't outrun, his expression cracked, softened, broke open along a seam that had long gone cold. His eyes closed, his breath hitched, his jaw trembled once, and then without meaning to, without even knowing how it started. Elias Hartley smiled, not wide, not bold, but real, warm, trembling. Alive, June cupped his cheek with her tiny palm. "Papa Bear." And Elias, voice hushed like a prayer he'd forgotten how to speak, whispered back, "Little cub." Behind them, the last light of day touched the ranch, gentle as mercy. And the man who had forgotten how to feel held the child who had reminded him why he still could. Night crept over Bear Creek Ranch, like a slow-falling curtain, the last orange light bleeding into deep blue as the lanterns on the porch flickered to life one by one, their glow stretching long shadows across the yard. But even with the soft hush of crickets and the gentle creak of wind against the barn, there was a tension in the air Elias could feel down to the bone, something coming, something he'd been preparing himself for since Warren Adler's threat scraped across his land like a rusted blade. He stood on the porch now, shoulders squared, arms crossed over his chest in a posture that looked calm, but carried the tight coil of a storm waiting to break. Inside the house, the triplets huddled close to their mother on the braided rug, June still occasionally lifting her head to make sure Elias hadn't stepped far from view. Sam had carved a new piece, a tiny wooden cub that he set carefully beside the crooked wooden bear Elias kept on the mantel, as if formally declaring the two belonged together. Cole hovered near the window, watching Elias through the glass with the reverence of a child who believed completely that the man outside could not lose. Their mother set a hand on each of their backs, her eyes fixed on Elias with a mixture of gratitude and fear she could barely speak aloud. When the first distant hoofbeat broke the quiet, she flinched. Elias didn't. He simply straightened a touch, his breath deepening as he stepped down from the porch with the slow, measured certainty of a man who had been preparing for this moment long before the sun set. 3 silhouettes emerged from the ridge, 2 riders flanking Warren Adler, who sat tall in the saddle as though he believed the night itself had come to serve him. Elias didn't move toward them. He stood in the center of the yard beneath the lantern glow, boots planted firm in the dirt that had finally begun to feel like home. Warren pulled his horse to a halt, smirking. "Evening, Hartley. Told you I'd be back." Elias's voice was steady. "And I told you you'd leave empty-handed." Warren snorted. "I've got witnesses, papers, a preacher's note saying she was promised to me. A judge will hear it." Elias shook his head once. "No judge looks at a promise made by fear and calls it a marriage." One of the riders shifted. "We ain't looking for trouble, Elias. He just wants her to talk to him." Warren's grin sharpened. "And I want those kids too. Folks have seen me with them before." Elias's jaw tightened, a low, dangerous heat pulsing under his skin. "You're not stepping near them." Warren dismounted with an arrogant flourish, tossing the reins to one of his men. "You gonna stop me, giant?" The door behind Elias opened with a soft creak, Sam, Cole, and June stepping onto the porch, their mother behind them. Elias lifted a hand without turning, signaling them to stay where they were. The children froze. June's small whisper drifted into the yard. "Papa Bear." Elias's throat tightened, but he remained still, eyes locked on Warren. The sound of that name, spoken by the child he'd saved, shifted something in the air. Warren's riders hesitated, glancing at the porch, at the children clinging to the railing as if they understood that this was no ordinary standoff. It wasn't about promises. It wasn't about papers. It was about the truth Warren had tried to bury and the family Elias had begun to build without ever meaning to. Warren spat onto the dirt. "Last chance. Give him to me, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Elias took one slow step forward, his shadow stretching long behind him, and for the first time that night, Warren stepped back. "You don't get to threaten children," Elias said softly, dangerously. "Not mine, not hers, not anyone's." The word mine stopped the night cold. Warren's men exchanged uneasy glances. Warren's smirk faltered, and the children on the porch straightened, recognizing what Elias himself hadn't meant to declare, that they were his now, not by blood, not by law, by choice, by protection, by the kind of love forged in storms and carved in silence. Warren's voice rose, cracking at the edge. "Get out of my way." Elias didn't move. "This ranch stands with them," he said. "I stand with them." The lantern flame flickered in the breeze, casting light across his face. Hard jaw set in iron, eyes burning with the kind of truth no paperwork could erase. "And you," Elias said, stepping closer, "don't belong on this land anymore." It was a warning, a promise, a beginning. And Warren finally felt fear bloom behind his bravado. He gripped the reins harder. Because tonight, the ranch wasn't his battleground. It was Elias Hartley's home, and Elias was done losing family. Dawn crept slowly across Bear Creek Ranch, its first pale gold rays stretching over the ridge like gentle hands brushing away the night's trembling breath, and as the light touched the yard, it found Elias Hartley still standing exactly where he had ended the long standoff, feet planted in the dirt, fists loose at his sides, chest rising with the unsteady relief of a man who had just faced down the last ghost capable of taking something from him. Warren Adler was gone, driven off not by violence, not by fists, but by the truth spoken in the steady voices of the very men he'd brought with him. When his riders realized the children called Elias Papa Bear, when they heard the tremor in Warren's own threats, when they saw the bruises on the woman's wrists Warren had claimed as promise rights, their greed soured into shame. They refused to stand with him. One even muttered, "Ain't chasing a woman who ran from fear," before turning his horse and riding off into the dark. Warren left last, spitting curses, threatening judges and contracts, but his words scattered in the wind like dust refusing to settle. Elias hadn't chased him. He didn't need to. Some storms broke on their own when they realized the land they tried to claim would no longer bow beneath their boots. Inside the house, the triplets had finally fallen asleep in a tangle of blankets near the hearth, worn out from the fear and the long hours of clinging to their mother, occasionally whispering "Papa Bear" into the folds of the quilts, as if reminding themselves of the truth when nightmares nudged too close. Their mother stepped onto the porch as the sun lifted higher, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, eyes soft and red-rimmed with exhaustion. She found Elias leaning against the post, watching the horses graze in the mist-laced pasture. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. Elias shrugged one shoulder. "Didn't need to." She stepped beside him, the boards warm beneath her bare feet, and followed his gaze across the land, his land, the one he'd spent years tending alone, carrying grief across every field like a shadow no sun could burn through. "They're safe now," she whispered, "because of you." Elias didn't speak for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were sorting 100 thoughts he'd never meant to voice. "I swore I'd never raise another child," he said finally. "Didn't think I had it in me. Didn't think I deserved to try." She shook her head softly. "You didn't fail your children, Elias. You lost them to a river, not your heart." His breath shuddered once, a raw, unguarded sound that slipped between the porch boards and into the soft morning. "Last night," he murmured, "when she called me Papa Bear, I felt something I thought I'd buried with them." She smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to a woman who had also lived through storms and knew the language of broken things finding shape again. "That means you're healing," she whispered, "not replacing. Healing." Elias looked at her then, really looked, and his eyes softened in a way no one in town would have believed possible. "They trust me," he said. "Those little ones. They chose me." She nodded, feeling tears well gently. Children don't choose lightly. A long silence stretched between them, gentle this time, not heavy. A silence that belonged more to a home waking than to a man hiding his grief. The ranch breathed around them, roosters crowing, horses snorting, the creek whispering as it wound through the meadow. Finally, Elias spoke again, voice low but clearer. "They need a place," he said, "a real place, a family." Her heart thudded. "And you?" Elias lifted his hand, tentative, rough, careful, and set it over hers on the porch rail. "I need one too," he said quietly. And in that moment, without declarations, without ceremony, without anything more than the truth laid bare between them, the ranch, his ranch, became something it had not been in years, a home, a place not shaped by solitude but by warmth, a place where a giant of a man remembered how to smile because 3 small voices had given him a name he never knew he needed. Behind them, the porch door creaked softly and June peeked out, hair tousled, doll tucked under her arm. She padded across the floorboards, climbed straight into Elias's arms, settled against his chest and whispered sleepily, "Papa Bear, you stayed." Elias held her close, eyes closing with a peace he'd never expected to feel again. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured, and as the rising sun spilled over them, over the ranch, over the woman beside him, over the triplets now waking inside, the man who never smiled let himself do it fully, openly, without fear, because his storms were finally behind him, and his family stood in the light. Some hearts stay silent out of fear, and some men carry storms inside them for years, until a small voice reminds them they were made for more. If this story touched you, like, share, and subscribe to Redemption West, where justice finds mercy and every soul earns a second sunrise.